Hello, this is John Harrod, President of U.S. Freedom Biofuels, and I want to welcome you to the manufacturing floor of U.S. Freedom Biofuels, where I want to walk you through our BD65AF animal fat processor. We're the only manufacturer in the world that does an animal fat processor on this size, on this scale. So the person who wants to make 200 or 300 or 400 or even 450 gallons a day of biodiesel out of animal fat can do it. But you can also take and use this same processor for waste vegetable oil, for pressed oil, whether it be canola oil, soybean oil, or if you're in cooler climates and want to use palm oil, it'll also work for palm oil. So let's walk around and take a look at the BD65. From a quick long shot, you can see that the BD65, every valve on the BD65 is numbered. The control panel is completely labeled so that there's no question as to what button does what. The manual is a step-by-step process. So the first time you do this, you may have to read the manual step by step, maybe even the second time. But by the third time you go through this process with our equipment, you probably won't have to look at the manual ever again. But it's a very simple process to make fuel with the BD65AF, whether you're using animal fat or waste vegetable oil or pressed seed oil. So let's go ahead and walk around the back side of the processor, because this is where it starts. If you were going to take and make your fuel out of waste vegetable oil, you would simply pump your waste vegetable oil or your pressed seed oil right into this tank right here. This tank is the preheat tank. It's the dewatering tank. A critical step in making your biodiesel fuel and making it ASTM spec is to get the water out of the feedstock. Whether you're using animal fat or you're using waste vegetable oil or you're using pressed oil, it's going to have moisture in it. You may not even see it. It may not fall out. In the case of animal fat, it definitely won't fall out. But in every 80 gallons of animal fat, you're going to have about 2 gallons of water. You've got to get that water out. If you don't get the water out, it will kill some of or all of your chemical reaction in the processor itself. And if it does that, if it even mutes some of the chemical reaction, that means you won't have a complete transesterification. You'll have some free glycerin, unprocessed feedstock in your fuel. It won't meet spec. So this is the tank that does the dewatering. And if we can get a shot inside this tank, that'd be outstanding, because you can see there's an element inside that tank, and that creates the 1400 degree temperature that the oil passes over, that rapidly expands the hydrogen and oxygen off of that feedstock, so that we can have that water fall to the bottom of the tank where it can be easily drawn off. And we can draw it off of this valve right here. This is the 1-inch valve, so we can draw that water off of there. We also have a heater down here at the bottom of this valve. So if you're using animal fat, we're able to get the animal fat and water through this valve because it's below the heat level. But we didn't forget about that animal fat being used in here. Underneath this processor, on the preheat dewatering tank, there's an extra 2,000 watts of heat right on the surface of the bottom of this tank. It's a little tough to get you a picture of that, but it's there. And that allows, because heat rises, it's right at the bottom of the tank, it allows that section below that element to remain liquid, so you can pull that fuel, the water and the sludge and the stuff that you don't want in your oil off. Now, this apparatus right here, this high temp hose, going over to this high temp pump to this small tank. This is used for transferring the hot animal fat after it's rendered. When you're dealing with rendering animal fat from the proteins, you're dealing with oil that's going to be in excess of 250 degrees. You don't want to be handling that with your hands, with buckets, even with a pump that isn't directly connected to that tank for safety reasons. We don't want anybody burn. So we've got a tank here that allows you to wheel up to, it's on wheels, so you can wheel it right up to the tank that you're using for rendering your fat. You'll have to have some kind of a rendering or a cook kettle to do that in. The grease can enter right here. The high temp pump, which will handle grease up to 400 degrees, can pump that grease safely at a rate of 3 gallons per minute right into our preheat dewatering tank through this hose, keeping you safe, keeping the grease from splattering. And this also has its own heat source on it. If you notice on the little control panel here, we've got a switch for the heat, a switch for the pump. So if you happen to leave some animal fat in here, it's going to get hard when it cools down. Animal fat solidifies at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll be able to flip the surface heat on. The heater is at the very bottom of this tank, right underneath, and that heat, of course, will reliquefy the animal fat. So let's assume for a minute that we've got our animal fat or our waste vegetable oil in the processor. And for the rest of this video, I'm going to be talking strictly about animal fat, but keep in mind this can be used for waste vegetable oil interchangeably. So let's walk around to the front of the processor for a minute. And I'm going to put the valves in all the closed position for now, just to start things out so we know exactly where everything is. All the valves will be in the off position. Okay, so we've got our water, excuse me, our feedstock in the dewatering tank and the preheat dewatering tank, which means that we would have this preheat switch on right here. We have our master timer on for the amount of time that we would be working with the processor, and this light would be glowing, indicating that that preheat tank is on. When we're ready to bring that grease, that animal fat from the preheat tank into the processor, we would turn off the preheat tank. We would walk around the back side of the preheat tank. We would take valve number 12 here. We'd have a bucket underneath here, and we would slowly drain off any water that had fallen to the bottom of this tank. With animal fat, you're going to get between 1 and 2 gallons with every 80 gallons of fat that you have in this tank. That's a constant with animal fat. Just like you and I are made up of a lot of moisture, so is a cow, so is a pig, so is a lamb. So drain the water off. All right, now that we've drained the water off, we're ready to come over here to the front of the processor and move our preheated, dewatered animal fat into the processor. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open valve 7. Then we're going to open valve 8. We're going to open valve 3, and we're going to open valve 2. We are then going to turn the processor pump on. The grease will begin to be pumped through this heated line, and as long as the animal fat is hot and there hasn't been anything in the line, you won't have to use the heat for the pipe. But let's say, for example, that you've done other batches of animal fat, and there might be animal fat in this pipe right here. Well, this is a heated pipe, so we may have to turn the pipe heat on. The indicator light would go on for the pipe heat. That would allow this pipe right here to be warmed so that the oil will flow through here into your pump and up in the top and down into your processor tank. We'll watch the sight tube, and we'll watch the grease rise in the sight tube. If you want to do a 40-gallon batch, you would stop here. If you want to do a 65-gallon batch, you would stop here. To stop it, you'd simply close valve number 7 and open valve number 5. And in doing so, that grease that was up here at this level will draw down in the tube. Once it's out of the sight tube, close off the sight tube. Let it circulate. You've got your pump on, so now it's circulating from the bottom of this tank up through the pump and back into the top and around and up in the top and around and up in the top. And it's passing by this bimetal 3-inch thermometer. What we're looking for, what we want for a temperature is 130 degrees Fahrenheit. 130 degrees Fahrenheit is optimum. You can be as high as 135, 138, but that's about it. You don't want to be hotter than that. That's as high as you want to go. So it's really critical that we don't overheat it in the preheat tank. The reason we built this transfer tank is so that that hot grease can be transferred over there, and with some heat loss going from your rendering process into that preheat tank. All right, we've got our oil now up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. That's where we want to be. At that point, we're going to come over to valve number 4 with the heat off now, because we've reached our temperature. This is the processor heat button. If we needed more heat, we flip this on. If we don't, we turn it off. We'll come over here to valve number 4, and we're going to pull a sample of that feedstock. And I'm going to walk over and show you what that's going to look like. We're going to pull a sample and then do what's called a titration test. We want to measure the free fatty acid level of that feedstock. So let's assume that we've pulled a sample, and let's go over to the workbench and do a titration test. Come on with me, we'll go do that right now. I'm going to grab a couple things here for that titration test. I'm going to grab a rag to lay on the bench. I'm going to go get a couple of tissues so that we can wipe out our tools. And we are ready to begin. Okay, the test for doing this is exactly the same whether you're using it for animal fat or you're using waste vegetable oil. This just happens to be some waste vegetable oil, so we'll go ahead and use that. First thing we do is we get our beaker out, put our beaker on the counter. We're going to put in our beaker 10 milliliters of isopropanol, 100% isopropanol. I like using the Napa brand, part number 7100. It's the Napa Max brand Thermo-Aid because it is 99.9% isopropanol. There's other products out there on the market that may contain injector cleaner, like Heat. If you buy the Heat brand, it's got injector cleaner in it. The injector cleaner will interfere with our titration test. Next step, we take the phenol indicator. By the way, everything that I'm using here, I provide with the processor, so you don't have to hunt this stuff down. It comes with your equipment. 3 drops of phenol indicator. Next step, we get our KOH solution. This is 1% KOH solution. My bottle looks a little dirty and grubby because it's been in use for about 7 years, but you will have a nice clean bottle when your equipment arrives. We're going to draw into here a little over 10 milliliters. We're going to take a stir rod. This stir rod, we want to make sure it's wiped clean, free of any dirt and oil. Drop it in there, and now we're going to add a couple of drops of our 1% KOH solution until we get a nice magenta color. It's a pretty color, isn't it? Now we're going to look at our syringe, and let's get it right down to 10 milliliters so we get an accurate measurement. There's 10 milliliters. Alright, now we're going to draw 1 milliliter of oil to be tested. So we take our 3 ml syringe, add 1 milliliter of oil. Again, all of this is stuff we provide for you, so you don't have to hunt it down. We'll go ahead and add that oil to our isopropanol phenol indicator solution. And we're going to start dropping some of our 1% KOH in here until we get to a slight pink color. Almost there. There we have it. Okay, we're at our light pink. Doesn't have to be very dark pink, just a slight pink. And you can see we went from 10 milliliters to 9 millimeters, past 8 millimeters to about 8.5 milliliters, which means we added 2.5 milliliters of KOH solution. 2.5 milliliters, if we grab our titration chart, which you'll have in the back of your manual, this happens to be for a 40-gallon batch of fuel, not the 65-gallon batch, but if we look across the chart here, 2.5 milliliters, it says that we have to add 1,610 grams of KOH, of potassium hydroxide, 1,610 grams. So that is the titration chart. What do we do with this information? Well, let's walk back over to the processor and I'll show you. Here at the processor, we have the induction tank. This is our methoxide induction tank. In this tank, we would put our methanol. We would put, in the case of a 40-gallon batch, 8 gallons. In the case of a 65-gallon batch, we'd put 13 gallons of methanol in there. Then we would wheel it over here. To our KOH flake, and we use KOH flake. We would take that 1,610 grams that was recommended by the chart. We would get out our digital scale. Once again, the digital scale provided to you when you bought your equipment from us. First thing we would do is find the tare weight We'd zero out the scale. At this point in time, you want to make sure you have rubber gloves on. And we would then go ahead and scoop out the potassium hydroxide, measure out 1,610 grams, and pour it into our methanol. Once it's poured in there, you're provided a rod for stirring it. You would stir that up for 1 minute to dissolve it. I'm going to go ahead and cover this up. You always want to keep your potassium hydroxide covered to make sure that it does not absorb any moisture. While I'm over here, I'm just going to put my tools away, clean everything up real quick, and we'll get back to the lesson. Clean up of our beakers, we never want to use soap and water. We just want to wipe them out with a clean, dry towel and set them aside. Any kind of chemical, soap and water would distort and destroy the integrity of your future tests. Keep your syringes clean. If you look at mine here, I've got it stuck in a beaker with a cloth around it so that it doesn't get contaminated. The same with my stir rod. I just keep it in a beaker with a cloth around it so it doesn't get contaminated. The syringe for the oil, not as critical. I just keep it separate. Okay, we're ready to take our methoxide solution now, wheel it back to our processor. And our processor has a couple of features here. It's got a dry break within this fitting right here. So even if you forget and leave this fitting open, this ball valve open, it won't leak. It also has a dry break in the female side. So until you put these two together, nothing can flow out of it. So the first thing we do is we connect this. We open this valve here. We open valve number 6. The pump is on. We are now drawing from the induction tank methoxide into our stream of oil. We're taking a metered amount of methoxide and a metered amount of oil, and it's being blended right here at the pump. This is where the chemical reaction occurs. It's going to take between 15 and 18 minutes for this methoxide to be drawn into the process. During that time, your oil is going to turn over several times in this process. In doing that, we're treating your oil over and over and over again. It's like making cookies. If you wanted to take and make a batch of chocolate chip cookies, and you took all the ingredients, including the chocolate chips, and poured it into your bowl, and you stirred that bowl up, and stirred it, and made sure everything was stirred up good, the chances of getting 12 chocolate chips in every cookie would be virtually impossible. What you'd need to do is place the chocolate chips in every cookie if you wanted 12 in every cookie. Well, what we're doing here with this injection system, rather than throwing all of our chemicals and oil together and hoping that it mixes up, we're placing the chemical into the oil over and over and over again. So every drop of oil, every drop of animal fat is treated with methoxide. So we have complete transesterification. This whole process of injection is going to take about 15 to 18 minutes, at which time, when this tank is empty, you simply close this valve, close valve number 6, pull them apart, set your tank off to the side for the next use. Set your timer here for about 45 minutes, at which time you can now have another batch of oil in your preheat tank, preheating and doing that step again while this is processing. All right, let's say, for example, now the process has been complete. Oh, one last thing I forgot to show you. After you're done injecting and after you've disconnected it, you want to make sure that valve number 1 here is closed. Valve number 1 is the valve on the back side of the processor. You want to give it a shot at valve number 1 over here. Can you see that one? Valve number 1, close that. That allows the process to happen under pressure. One of the keys to making the glycerin fall fast in our processor is pressure. Rather than waiting hours for the glycerin to drop, our glycerin drops in a matter of minutes after the processor shuts off. So let's assume that about 45 minutes has transpired. The processor is shut off. We're going to wait about 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to let that glycerin fall to the bottom. After about 15 minutes, we'll come back here to valve number 1. We'll reopen valve 1 first. Then we'll come over here to valve number 4. And at valve number 4 and a bucket, we'll begin to drain off our glycerin. In a 65-gallon batch, depending on the titration number, you're going to pull off somewhere between 16 and as much as 25 gallons of glycerol. That's glycerin and methanol combined. Most of your methanol is going to be in this glycerol, and that's where our methanol recovery system comes in. You can take that glycerol, put it in the methanol recovery system, and recover that methanol and reuse it. But that's for another video. All right, so we're pulling off the glycerol here. Let's assume we've pulled off all of our glycerin to the point where we see fuel. We go ahead and shut valve number 4. We come over here, we hit our pump, turn our processor pump on, and again we're circulating from 5 past valve 8, back up into the top and back around. We're going to do that for about 30 seconds, and then we're opening valve 9 and shutting valve 8. What that does is brings the fuel from the processor into the methanol flash tank. Methanol flash is a critical step to the quality again of your fuel. There's 5 things we do differently here at US Freedom Biofuels with our equipment than everybody else. One is the preheat dewatering tank. We get the water out of the feedstock. Number 2, we use a pressurized system for processing. Number 3, methoxide injection. We inject using methoxide injection so that every drop of oil is treated. Number 4 is the methanol flash, where we flash off the trace amounts of methanol that's left in the fuel. There's only going to be about 6 to 8 ounces of methanol that carries over in the fuel, but that's enough to throw off the flash point of the fuel and create every horror story you've ever heard about as far as biodiesel is concerned. You know, you may have heard the stories. I used biodiesel and my filters plugged up. I used biodiesel and my fuel system was leaking. I used biodiesel and my injectors are cracked. Has nothing to do with biodiesel. It has everything to do with poorly made biodiesel with methanol being left in the fuel. Methanol has a molecular structure many times smaller than diesel fuel or biodiesel. Biodiesel has a micron structure of 0.003. Methanol is 0.0006. So any weakness in the fuel system, it will weep through the fuel system. Any moisture in the fuel system, methanol will surround it and try to move that through your fuel filter. If it moves it through your fuel filter, it will plug it up. If it gets through your fuel filter with all that moisture, it will crack your injectors, because your injectors are not designed to let things that are bigger than 0.003 through it, and now you're trying to move a 238 micron water molecule into your injector, and something will break your injector. All right, so methanol flash, and that's what this tank does. We brought our fuel over here. It's filled up now with 65 gallons of our biodiesel from animal fat at this point. We're going to go ahead and turn that pump off. And we're going to turn the methanol flash switch on. Methanol flash is the bottom right timer. We go ahead and turn that on for a little over an hour. The light will come on. And inside this tank, if you want to get a shot on the inside, there is a heating element on the inside. You have to come around the other side, I think. Can you see in there okay? Mm-hmm. All right, that's the heating element. That heating element's a 5,500 watt element. It's going to bring that fuel up to 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Methanol flashes at 143, so it'll take the vapors of that methanol and basically expel them into the atmosphere harmlessly. Not going to hurt anything. It's not going to hurt anybody's respiratory system or cause any fires, but it gets those vapors and just expels them so they're not in the fuel. Again, it's about 6 to 8 ounces and 65 gallons of fuel. So it's not a lot, but it's critical to get it out. All right, once it's out, I didn't hook one up, but we would, after this shuts off, we'd be ready to put that through the dry wash tower. But before we do that, we should have a cooling tower. In between valve number 10 and the dry wash tower is where your cooling tower would go. I'm going to grab a cooling tower just so you can see what I'm talking about. I didn't bring one out earlier, but we'll get one here. This is a US Freedom Biofuels cooling tower. We're going to go ahead and hook that up as if it was going to be installed in this unit. would be taking and flowing water through this tower at a flow rate of a gallon per minute. That water can come from a static source or it can come from a direct water supply. Either way, but a gallon per minute is all we need. Water will flow through here. Your fuel is going to come out of this tank at 175 degrees. But we cannot go through the dry wash tower unless it's under 100 degrees. So we either have to wait for nature to cool this fuel down, or we have the cooling tower, which will strip all the heat off in a matter of 3 seconds. It'll go from 175 to under 100 degrees, actually down to about 70 degrees in 3 seconds. And then we're going to flow through our dry wash tower from the bottom up. We're going to flow our fuel. And our fuel is going to come out of this hose right here. And we've done that with this processor just to give you an idea. This is the fuel, ASTM spec, ready to go into any diesel engine. So if you can get a shot of that, that's actual biodiesel right there. It's clean, clear, ready to go into any engine. I did a couple of tests earlier, and let me see if I can find my jars for the test, and cut. All right, I found my samples here. This is a sample. Unfortunately, the label's a little bit on this bottle, but this is a water test. And you can see a very clear line between the water at the bottom and the fuel at the top. That is what you're looking for in the water test. You do not want to see any third line in there. If there was poor fuel made, you would see a third line right here of a discoloration. Could be soap, could be unprocessed glycerin, it could be feedstock. But here we have a nice, clear, clean, straight line, perfect fuel. I also did what's called a 327 test. And the 327 test is 27 milliliters of methanol along with 3 milliliters of our fuel. And within 30 seconds of doing that, if you shake this up and let it sit for 30 seconds, nothing should fall out of this. And I can tell you that nothing will and nothing has. I did this test actually yesterday on the fuel, and it's absolutely perfect. These are the kind of results that you're going to get every single time. ASTM spec fuel from your equipment each and every time. Fuel that you can put into any diesel engine in production today, whether that be a truck, tractor, automobile, planetary, generators, any diesel engine. All right, so just to give you a quick summation, the master timer on the BD65AF controls the entire unit. So even if you're doing a process and you've got something in the preheat tank and you've got your methanol flash going, or you've got your dry wash tower going, you can have all of that going. The master timer controls everything. So let's say that you know that you've got about an hour's left of work to do here, but you don't want to wait around and turn everything off. The master timer will shut the whole system down for you. Whether you come back in an hour or you come back in a week, you just pick up where you left off. Simultaneously, in this processor, you can be preheating, processing, methanol flashing, or dry washing, all at the same time. That's how we get the production out of a BD65AF. It allows you to get about 60 gallons of fuel out of this unit every 60 minutes, or once every hour, about 60 gallons of fuel. So we want to thank you for stopping by U.S. Freedom Biofuels, and we look forward to talking to you again real soon. This is John Herod, President of U.S. Freedom Biofuels, saying goodbye for now.